In November of 1868, there was another presidential election. Republicans selected Ulysses S. Grant, the former Civil War hero, as their presidential nominee. The Democrats selected Horatio Seymour of New York. Grant barely won the popular vote, and it was attributable to enfranchise black voters. Here you can see in the chart that Ulysses Grant won by less than 300,000 votes. Had African American males over the voting age of 21 not been able to vote, it's very possible that Horatio Seymour would have at least won the popular vote, if not for the electoral vote. So the irony of this is that the southern states, who just had new constitutions written, allowed African Americans the right to vote. However, the northern states did not. Again, the 14th Amendment stipulated that states could allow African American males the right to vote. So very quickly, after becoming president, Congress created the 15th Amendment, which gave full suffrage for all African American males. And again, that was primarily for the benefit of northern states. There was still the question, though, of what should be done for African Americans economically in the South. Now that they are citizens of the United States, now they have voting rights, how are they going to do well economically? The main idea was for sharecropping. This is where large landowners split their estates into small units and gave the black family housing, animals, and tools and other supplies. In return, the African Americans supplied the labor. Both the labor and the owner split the profits. This enabled African Americans to get ahead, but most were unable to save enough money to buy their own land. The lack of capital hurt poor whites and African Americans from sharecropping. Some tried crop lien, which forced farmers to rely on next year's crop to pay for the seed. However, bankers wanted valuable cash crops such as cotton. In the case of a bad year for, perhaps disease, the boll weevils, or maybe for drought, then their property would be confiscated. So sharecropping did not work very well. All in the South, people fared poorly relative to the expansion in the North and the West during the time. Additionally, and here you can see the pictures depicting on the left the old slave plantation, where you had the slave quarters very close to the main house, and then it would be divided up differently regarding sharecropping. Other problems that existed for the freedmen was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which formed in 1866. Ulysses Grant, who was president, went after the KKK. And you have to understand that what is the KKK? First of all, it was a terrorist organization of Protestant white males. And the Ku Klux Klan wasn't just against African Americans. It also hated Catholics. It hated modern women. And it hated liberal lifestyles. So in the South, the Ku Klux Klan predominantly campaigned against African Americans. So why did they begin this terrorist campaign? The idea was to intimidate African Americans from going out to vote. If they were to vote, they were going to vote Republican. And they combined with poor whites to give Republicans a majority in these southern states. So if you terrorize African Americans and threaten them through lynching, which is hanging people from a tree, or if you were to burn a cross on someone's front lawn, that's going to scare them from possibly going out to vote. African Americans were not intimidated by that because of Ulysses S. Grant. He would send the army against Klan members, and they generally hunted them down. So during this period, while the Ku Klux Klan was a nuisance, they were able to be controlled, unless it would be in very rural areas. Many of the people of the North were starting to become ambivalent. They felt they lost hundreds of thousands of Americans due to the Civil War. It cost them a lot of money. They freed the slaves. Now they should be on their own. And many people in the North wanted to get on with their business. Business was investing in expanding. For example, the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1869, you would have the first union of the Central Pacific as well as the Union Pacific. Here, I'm hoping I can get my cursor up here. In Promontory Point, Utah. This is where they joined. This would be the first transcontinental railroad, and they would be followed by other railroads to the north and south. This would be the first link between the West Coast and the East Coast. Again, to open up the new lands with the different mineral resources and the new farmland and so forth. So the people were no longer feeling as if they wanted to still deal with the Civil War. The Civil War is over. African Americans gained their freedom. Let's move on to our own business. Finally, Ulysses S. Grant served for 8 years. You have another election in 1876. The Republicans selected Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrats selected Samuel Tilden. However, you can see in these statistics, there's 3 states with asterisks: Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Look at the popular vote. The Democrats won the popular vote by 300,000. And there was a lot of evidence that there was cheating by the Republicans in Florida and those other 2 states. So the election was in dispute. Under the Constitution, if that happens, it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives votes who is going to be the next president. The House of Representatives was primarily Republican or majority Republican, but if they would select Rutherford B. Hayes, and that would look as a scandal. So what resulted was the Compromise of 1877. The Democrats created a compromise that said, okay, Rutherford Hayes can become president, so you can have a Republican. However, all federal troops that are still in the South would have to leave, so they would have to go back north. The result of this was that the Ku Klux Klan could now go out in force, and African Americans would be intimidated. They would not show up in force to go out to vote, and because of that, many of these states then reverted to the Democrats. And the old Confederates started to get their power back, and they started to pass law disenfranchising African Americans, while they would still have the right to vote technically under the 14th and 15th Amendment. Southern states would pass laws such as a poll tax designed to punish voters that were poor, that they could not afford to vote, or they would instigate other laws such as literacy tests. They would also begin segregation, where African Americans would be treated as second-class citizens, where there would be white schools and African American schools. There would be areas on a bus for a white section versus an African American section. So this was the result of the Compromise of 1877. It more or less disenfranchised African Americans, and they became second-class citizens of the United States.